Hey guys, thanks for joining me. I want to go ahead and take just a moment to set a couple things straight from my interview with Ian Bick on his podcast Locked In, uh, which dropped yesterday on Spotify. Uh, I want to make it clear when I'm having a conversation with Ian Bick, and we're pretty much talking about prison. That's what the podcast centers around: is crime, justice, prisoners, guards. And Ian's a great interviewer. He's got a great podcast. And it was a real honor to be able to be on his podcast and kind of be able to give a little bit of insight into a small slice of what time and what prison looked like for me. And so I just kind of want to take a moment, getting ready to start my own podcast. I've got my podcast studio just about set up. And I just kind of wanted to expound upon and kind of explain, there's really no bragging there. None of the stories that I told, um, I wasn't really trying to brag them. It's just part of my life. It's a part of my life where, I was incarcerated. I had a lot of time to do several times, and I had a hard time conforming to, being told what to do. When to sleep, where to go, what to eat, when to eat. I never did well with people trying to control me, and so it was easy for me to lash out. And a lot of what I was explaining to Ian and what we talked about centered upon, some wild experiences that I had while I was in prison. And, while it may not seem that way, to be truthful, I actually drummed quite a bit of it down. And I kind of get animated, and you'll get in the mind frame and remembering some of those stories. And almost like a, not a euphoric, but it's like a memory of something that was just wild and intense. Um, some of those stories, are from in the 90s when I was in Wyoming State Prison. Um, some stories from, my two stints in federal prison, the first of which I was acquitted of after nearly 6 years. The second, which I did a 10-year sentence. And then after that, I was transferred to state prison to serve a state sentence for bail jumping. And so I just wanted to touch base and kind of reiterate that it really wasn't about bragging. Um, I've never been a tough guy. I didn't go into prison. I wasn't one of them guys that walked around trying to act tough. Pretty much any physical altercations I got into, rarely did I instigate or did I, you know, cause them to happen. Usually it was reactive. So some of those things can kind of seem a little bit out of line, if you will, with what you might experience or think of, but as a lot of people have done prison time in, all the state prisons and federal prisons are different. I see comments, with the trolls, in my state prison, you couldn't have done this or you couldn't have done that, and everybody likes to feel, I suppose, that the prison they were at, was the hardest or was run the best way. And, that's each person's experience. I'm not here to speak on, what someone in Philadelphia prison did or what they allowed or who they would smash or steal from or try to take advantage of. I never been in any of that. Um, Basically, it just really came down to is that I've never been a victim. I've never allowed myself to be a victim. I didn't go into prison with a soft mind frame of, how I'm scared, I don't know what to do, what's going to happen. And that came from a young age being locked up. I was used to meeting new people in a possibly violent, environment. And so it's just kind of a lifestyle that, when I was in prison, and if I were to go to prison today, I have kids, I stay out of trouble, I don't do anything. I respect my community. I try to help other people get out of prison that are getting out. I give them advice. Um, I try to explain to them, some of the things that I learned that helped me change my thought process and who I am and the way that I conduct myself in the community. But that being said, when you're in prison, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of bad things that can happen, and sometimes the best way to stay safe is kind of more to be proactive, so you get to a prison, people try you, they don't know. You look at me, some people have made comments, off of Ian Bicks' Locked In podcast. People made comments, oh, look at him, he looks soft, and, I do, I dig that. And, it's kind of like a chameleon, that can change colors, or some type of a, toad that maybe looks harmless, and isn't. So some people are under the belief, I suppose, that you have to look, hard, to be not be a victim. Um, I've never done that. I've seen some of the guys that looked like, possibly sex offenders, or looked like maybe, they touched some kids, or something, but didn't, And some of those guys I've met, and I'm sure some of the people watching this that have been to prison, I've seen similar. Some of those guys are killers. Some of those guys, are very, very adept at playing low key, but when things happen, they can be very dangerous. And there's a big misconception that you have to have, your face tattooed and your neck tattooed, to be a tough guy. Many years ago, a lot of bikers, that was, they're tough guys and, whatnot. But basically now, anybody can get a tattoo on their face or their neck. I never personally was into that. I know a lot of really, really solid, scary, bad dudes, who do have facial and neck tattoos. And so, but I also know a lot more soft dudes, soft cats who are doing prison time, who have facial tattoos and neck tattoos, and you look at him, you're like, that's a scary looking dude. And them dudes are soft as medicated cotton. Some of them, as probably many of you, if you really did time before, a lot of those guys use that, as a defense mechanism. It's more like a chameleon blending in, with its surroundings. And so sometimes some of those guys will get to prison and they may be rats, they may have past sex offenses, or they just may generally be all around a soft guy, who doesn't want to be in there. Like most people don't want to be in there. And sometimes you jump in with a group of guys, hey, let's work out, let's hang out, tattoos. And, a lot of guys, I see them, they'll come in prison without a tattoo one, and right to the neck, right to the face, getting tattoos. And you guys know, some of you guys have seen that. A lot of you guys that did time, you know what I'm talking about. The trolls can say what they want. Those guys mostly were just, in county jails or did some soft little sentence, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the fact of the matter is, looking scary and having tattoos and doesn't make you necessarily a dangerous person. I don't consider myself a dangerous person, but like I said, I'm not a victim. I've never really been, victimized, in prison, somebody trying to assault me or take my commissary. That's never really happened. And, and to be frank, I never really put up with that, of other people doing that. As many of you guys know, there's different races and different things going on. A white guy can't get involved in, the decisions of different cars, different races and gangs and groups, depending on what groups they are. And so basically, as I was saying about the defense, mechanism, and, part of not being a victim is standing up for yourself. And so, there's times when something happens, you get to a prison and someone tries you. Look, you can't just say, no, look, I don't want no problems, man. Immediately you're going to be victimized and everybody's going to start taking advantage of you. And the guys who would have stood up for you are now going to not stand up for you. They're going to say, you know what, whatever, that guy's not willing to stand up for himself. We're not willing to stand up for him then. And so from a young age, in juvenile in Montana, the juvenile place is called Pine Hills. The first day I got there, I had a lighter that I snuck in, and some guys wanted to use it, and I told them, no, I get a smoke with you. And they said, no, you're not smoking our cigarette, give us the lighter. And, there was three of them, they were trying to, take my lighter. And so I said, all right, you can use it. And we went to the bathroom, and I pulled the lighter out, and I hit the guy. Um, and those guys ran off, and they told on me. So they literally went from being, violent and trying to press me and take something from me to showing their true colors and telling. They went immediately to the guards. They told them that I had assaulted one of them and that I had a lighter. Um, those are the kind of snaky things that happen in prison. So if you looked at those guys, if some of you would have watched just the first part, you would have thought those are some bad dudes. And in reality, they were just soft. They tried to press somebody, and when it didn't work out the way they thought it would, they ended up telling. And so I was moved, to a higher security unit. Got some fights there right away, and then I was moved to the maximum security unit. And some of my later episodes, we'll get into some of the things that went down, um, there. And, I actually have the paperwork from that place. So I have quite a voluminous amount of paperwork. I've got hundreds of pounds of paperwork. It was one of the things I always kind of saved everything. So, with that said, um, it's about not being a victim. And if you go to prison and you start acting soft right away, or someone presses you and it would be great. I would love to just say, look, you guys, I just want to do my time and go home. Unfortunately, that's not always an option. Um, that option sometimes, and it happens, guys get in there. I've seen it untold number of times. And some of you guys that did some time, you know what I'm talking about. You've seen it. Guy gets in there, he's soft. People try to press up on him, and if he doesn't stand up for himself, he becomes a mark, and it ends badly, and he does really bad time, and he ends up sending money to people and giving commissary and ends up in protective custody. It can go any number of ways. And so that was my thing, was always, look, if I feel like someone's pressing me, or, I need to stand my ground, then I've always just made it hit right away. I don't take time. I don't run around and try to get people on my side. That was just never my style. There's hundreds of thousands of people in prison. Everybody does prison time the way they want to do it and the way they see fit. And for me, I like to make a mark, right away, and let it be known, like, hey, this guy's not playing around. He just got here, and these guys, try to talk greasy to him, or, try to press him. And, he immediately, just got down. And so, like state prison in Texas, you guys know, you do a heart check, that's something that's pretty common down there. I've met a lot of good guys from Texas, and, sometimes I think it's a thing down there, from what I understand, is you get in there and they make you go in the cell and, and box it out, see if you've got some heart. And whether that's, appropriate or not is, besides the point. So it's really not so much bragging. I wasn't really trying to brag in my interview with Ian Bicks, so much as kind of just tell some wild stories, some things. My family and my friends, the people that have known me my whole life, they constantly talk about, my books and having a podcast and, my stories. And there's a lot of things that I lived through that I forgot about. Quite frankly, I was talking to a friend of mine, Shannon, the other day. I was in prison with him. And, he was telling me about some times that I had gotten some fights. And he was like, you remember this guy? You did this or you did that. And I didn't even remember those things, So some of this stuff, most guys that went to prison, they know every fight they got into. It's a big deal for them. They're like, oh man, I beat this guy up, and they feel great about it. It wasn't really feeling great about anything. It's just, there was, looking the way that I look, and I'm a very nice guy. I'm not aggressive by any stretch of the imagination. I'm assertive. And so, for some reason, and a lot of times people didn't like the way I come off. There's probably a ton of people watching this now don't like the way I come off, think he's smug, or, whatever. That doesn't bug me. It's just, for whatever reason, sometimes I try to stay by myself, in federal prison, there's whites, there's blacks, there's Mexicans, there's gangs, there's, everything. And, I'm white, so by the color of my skin, I'm a white guy. I got along with every race there was in there. I never joined any kind of gangs. And quite frankly, a lot of people didn't like that. A lot of guys, group up in prison. You guys know what I'm talking about, whether you were in the groups or not. Some of you guys understand what I'm talking about is that, uh, it's easier to get in there and find a crew and hang out with them and work out and cook together and, go to recreation together. And so for me, I'd meet a couple people, but I didn't just jump into a group right away. I didn't get to prison and really feel the need or want to just immediately jump in with the first guys, that hit me up and said, "What's up, brother? We're gonna hit the weight pile tomorrow. Tomorrow we're gonna go do some burpees. Come over here, eat with us at our table." I was more like stayed back. I didn't jump right in the pool. I dip my toe in the water, feel the water, and I'd get a feel for, the inmates on the yard and the convicts on the yard, and kind of, take my time. And I saw a lot of people that would just immediately jump right in, just poof. And a lot of times, it was drugs. A lot of people go to prison for drugs or alcohol or something related. I never struggled with drug addiction or alcohol use. It was always crime. So, when I got to a prison, a lot of people are like getting high, let's face it. And, people come up to you right away, fresh money. You're coming in like, "Hey, what's up, man? Where you from? What do you got? You got anything? You got some money? You want to buy some dope? You want to get high?" And I was always, like, "No, I appreciate it, man. I'm from Montana," and it was kind of like, "Oh, Montana, that's nowhere cool. He doesn't get high." There's a lot of dudes who didn't really, that was like, once I told them that, it was it. And so, I did my own thing, and I just tried to feel the place out. I'm not all uppity. I don't think I'm something special by any means. I like to find people that have the same kind of code of ethics that I have. I spent, nearly my entire life in prison. And so I got along better with, the older convicts, who were more laid back. Um, that was just, the type of people I got along with, bank robbers. I really didn't really get along with the guys. I didn't, hang out so much, with the guys who were getting high, and running around, in gangs and whatnot, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of those guys. There's a lot of really good dudes. My co-defendant, one of my co-defendants, I'll probably have him on this podcast. He's in one of the big white gangs. He's a really good dude, probably one of the most wildest dudes I've ever met. Did a lot. He's got his life together now. And he looks the part. You see him on here when he comes on, you're going to say, "Wow, that dude looks scary." And, he is scary. And it's not just the tattoos. So, I don't mean to brag. The show with Ian really wasn't about bragging. I kind of got to telling some stories, and unfortunately, I kind of thought he was going to cut and paste. I didn't realize it was just going to all be out there, as it was, which is fine. And I really held back on quite a few things. There's a lot of things that just don't need to be said. But really what it is I'm into reform. I like to help people get out of prison. I like to help people stay out of prison. And that's part of what my podcast is going to touch on, is some of the things you can do when you got out of prison to stay out. Things, to develop healthy relationships with your family and with your community, with your parole or your supervision officer, ways that you can, stay out of trouble and stay away from high risk people and places and activities. These all kind of combine. And something I'm going to touch on a lot is the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So all of my life, I allowed my mind to think about crime and to think about, hitting licks. And I didn't realize that that's becoming who I am, and it's coming into my subconscious mind. And little by little, it's causing me to have the thoughts and the ideas of committing crime. And, none of it I'm proud of. It's nothing to be proud of. It just is the life that I lived, a farmer, that went and grew crops, that's what he did, and, there's things to be proud of in that, feeding, your community and doing something good, growing something out of the ground. For me, going to prison and committing crimes is nothing to be proud of. It's just the life that I lived. If I could go back and do it all over again, would I? Absolutely. There's in crime, there's victims. Sometimes, just because I don't have any sex or violent crimes, people are still victimized. The company that I stole the firearms that belonged to them, they were victimized. The insurance company that had to pay them back, for those firearms, they were victimized. Uh, the the workers of the warehouse, that had to endure polygraphs and scrutiny that they may have been. Those guys were victimized. If I could go back and change things and not have done that crime, I would in a heartbeat. There's a lot of things that end up happening. My children ended up in a lot of bad situations where if dad was home and able to take care of them, that those bad situations likely wouldn't have happened. And so there's nothing to be proud of. I didn't mean to glorify anything. Yeah, I do have a huge problem with sex offenders and with child molesters. Um, it touched close to home, with my family and my children. And so being in prison and being around sex offenders and people that had harmed children was very difficult for me. It was hard for me to look at them and I have a lot. There's a lot of times I constantly see. I saw today in the local news. Sometimes these sex offenders, these guys that harm children and whatnot, the sentences just seem to be entirely not enough. And that's frustrating to go into prison and see sometimes kids, young guys, with 20, 21 years old doing 20 and 30-year sentences, for selling drugs. And, a lot of them really didn't even really realize what they were getting into. A lot of them were, using drugs and began selling it. It kind of got a lifestyle. And now they're doing 20, 30 years. And, to juxtapose that upon sometimes, these guys who harm children, sometimes horrifically, and to see them not really get the amount of time that it seems like they would get, to protect society from them, and to protect future children from being harmed, it frustrated me. And then it was, I really didn't know how to deal with my personal emotions concerning that well. And so it came out that, I didn't like these sex offenders, and I would treat them bad. And to be quite frank, many years ago, that was kind of accepted within the prison system. What a lot of people, and I'll touch on this in some other episodes, what a lot of people really don't understand is most of the time nowadays, the sex offenders, they freely walk the yards. They have groups, they have their own tables. Nobody molests them or messes with them. There's a lot of, you get in big trouble. I was transferred many times for harming sex offenders. And so it's just something that's always, been something for me. And sometimes I acted, definitely what many in society would consider inappropriately by, doing some things to those guys. So it's not something that I'm proud of. It's just something that is. It is. I did what I did. I spent a lot of my life in prison, 25 years of my life incarcerated. And I wasn't a conformist, so I didn't kind of go in there and just stick my head down and, draw and stay to myself and be quiet. I was in there, I played a lot of poker, I ran stores, I loaned out money at times. It was just, I was still alive. It wasn't like I was in this cocoon where I was like, okay, I'm going to get out. And so it became a way of life, and that became easier to continue to get out and to commit crimes. I felt comfortable enough, incarcerated. I no longer feel that way. Things have changed, the way prisons are, the convicts, a lot of you guys, if you're watching this, you know what I'm talking about. The era of the convict is kind of dead. It's the era of the inmate. So a lot of these guys, they cooperate in there, and even a lot of the gangs, they cooperate with SIS, which, when it's not in the feds, that's kind of the investigatory side of the prison system, kind of like the FBI, so to speak. They investigate things that are happening in there, whether it's guards bringing in drugs or inmate and gang activity, and violence that happened, or anything like that. They kind of investigate it. And so a lot of times these gangs, it's what they do. They go and they tell the SIS who can and can't be on the yard. And that's not how I grew up. I grew up in a different, where it was more like, you don't tell the guards, hey, this guy can't come out. You let that guy come out on his own, and then things are handled in a different way. And so basically, with all that said, I just kind of want to touch base and post this little short, episode of as a follow up to the 3.5 hour interview that I did for Ian Bicks and his podcast Locked In. It was a good time. Ian's a great guy. Matty Ice, his assistant, pretty cool guy, man. It was definitely an honor to go over there and be part of their little setup, and they're very inspiring. And so I just wanted everyone to know, basically, if you're curious, look, I'm not really glorifying it. I'm not happy with all the things that I did in my life. I don't know anybody that is. I'm not happy with some of the people, that were victimized, by my actions. And I look forward to paying homage to them by being a better person, by bringing more positivity to my community, by helping people that are returning. I recently spoke with several people that asked me about possibly going to the jail or the youth services center, and talking to some of them younger guys. And I love that, and I look forward to it. If I could maybe just help even a couple guys not end up going to prison and committing crimes and maybe staying out, that would be great. The life I lived in and out of prison, it wasn't a fun life. It was dumb, looking back. And I just thank God that I'm here now and I'm able to raise my kids, and be a part of my community. Not everybody that has a history or has a felony is necessarily a bad guy. Where I live,